Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am so happy to have Nicole Graev Lipson with us. And this is her book with all my notes in it. And let me tell you a little bit about Nicole. She's the author of the memoir and essays, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters. Her writing has appeared in The Sun, Virginia Quarterly Review, LA Review of Books, The Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and Marie Claire, among other venues. Her work has been awarded a Pushcart Prize, shortlisted for a National Magazine Award, and selected for the Best American Essays Anthology. She lives outside of Boston with her husband and children. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me, Estelle. It's a joy and honor to be here.
Well, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And we first connected when we were both at the AWP 2024 in Kansas City. I think I was going to an offsite event with Joanna Rakoff was in it, and Maggie Smith, and oh gosh,
Kelly McMasters.
Oh, the great Kelly
Yes.
McMasters. Yes. And Rena, it was a great event. And we spoke, and you told me that you were having a book come out, and you had recognized me from a Facebook group we were in, and also my podcast. And so I was so thrilled to meet you and happy to get your book, which is just so wonderful. And it's your debut, right?
It is, yes. My debut memoir.
Okay, so we're going to dive deeply into this. And this book is getting such great accolades also. You have wonderful blurbs from Joanna Rakoff and Courtney Maum, and just so many wonderful writers. Kelly McMasters, who was on an episode, so was Joanna, so was Maggie. So first of all, we start with Kate Chopin, My Mother and Me. And you talk about your mother smoking before she was a mother, and you sort of use the object of the cigarette to entree into perhaps another part of the story and your connection to it. And I think it's so interesting because you talk about like a potential secret without at that point revealing what the secret is. And can you talk to me about how you decided to start the memoir and essays with this particular choice of writing about your mother and segueing to writing about you as a mother?
That's a great question. Well, I'll start by saying the opening sentence of the book is My mother smoked before she was a mother. And the scene that I open with, I describe this moment of my mother had a drawer. I think maybe many mothers have a drawer like this. It was like scarves and, lint brushes but buried at the bottom of this drawer were just old photographs, Polaroids taken from before my brother and I were born. And they weren't hidden from us for any particular reason. There was nothing secretive about these photos. But I knew they were there, and I liked to look through them because there was something about them, especially the way they captured my mother, that crystallized and clarified for me in a way that was really powerful how much my mother was a layered and complex human being beyond being my mother or a mother with a capital M. And
Yeah.
that should, of course, be obvious. Of course, I knew intellectually that my mother had a life before we were born, and that she was once a young girl, and that she was once a younger woman. But the particular photo I describe, my mother is in a velour catsuit with a plunging neckline. Her hair is long and flowing to her waist. She is sprawled across a love seat. She's smoking a cigarette and she is squeezing my father's cheeks in this kind of flirtatious, playful way. And this particular photo just had this profound effect on me and sort of clarifying for that. Like, wow, my mother is someone other than my mother, who I knew to be quite different. The mother that I grew up with was pretty staid, dressed fairly conservatively. She was an elementary school teacher. She was very health conscious and, sprinkled her food with lecithin, which there was sort of a health craze in the 80s of this kind of heart healthy supplement. The point being that she definitely did not smoke. She definitely never seemed to me like the type of person who would be wearing cat suits. So, because that essay, Kate Chopin, My Mother and Me, that begins the collection and all of the collection focuses a lot on the stories that we as women absorb from our culture, sort of templates that we step into of what womanhood should be like, what womanhood is supposed to look like. One of the reasons that I wanted to start with that scene was because I felt like it served as a really good overture to a theme that carries through the book, which is the blurry boundary between truth and fiction when one is a woman, and how the stories that we inherit from our culture can become entangled with our own until we no longer really know what parts of us are true at times. And I also wanted to start there because my mother does end up being an important character in the book. And our relationship is important. The evolution of our relationship is important. It felt right to start with her as a character.
That's great. And it's interesting because I've read a lot of pieces and a lot of books on motherhood, and yours has a real literary bent because you, even at one point, you talk about As You Like It, the
Mhm.
Shakespeare play, and
Mhm.
you equate that to what was going on with your daughter at the
Mhm.
time. Can you talk a little bit about your choices of layering the literary piece with the piece of the real life stuff that was going on?
Absolutely. I imagine that anyone who's a passionate reader might feel this way too. Reading has always been a really important part of my life. I was a bookworm growing up and an English major and a high school English teacher for many years. And so literature has really informed the way I look at the world. And I also feel like reading to me is not separate from living. It's not like here's my real life and here are the books I'm reading. Like it feels very entwined. So I knew writing this book that my encounters with literature were going to be part of it. And I sort of wanted to give myself a challenge of could I dramatize my encounters with literature in the way that they feel sometimes in real life, in terms of how they profoundly change the way I look at a particular aspect of my life. And so I feel like it was very natural for them to come into the essays because each of these essays starts with some kind of confusion on my part, something that is bewildering me or perplexing me. And I'll give as an example A Place or a State of Affairs, which is the essay about my longing for solitude, how I need solitude so deeply in my bones, and how hard it is to access solitude as a woman and particularly as a mother. And that essay started out of my sort of longing to understand what exactly solitude is, why I crave it so deeply, but also why it feels transgressive as a mother. And I feel like there are certain types of solitude that are sort of socially sanctioned for mothers, or escapes from the family that are socially sanctioned. Like if I were to say, oh, I'm going for a mom's night out dinner night, right? Like nobody would blink an eyelash at that. But if I said, okay, I'm gonna go out tonight and just go to the movies alone because I need to just have some time alone, there's something very taboo about that in our culture. So I wanted to explore that. And then as I was thinking about that, I started to also reflect on how central the romanticizing of solitude is in the sort of literary imagination for American literature and just the American story, the American psyche. And so that led me to want to revisit some canonical works of literature that focus on solitude or where solitude is so central to the story. So whether that's like Thoreau's Walden or, Huckleberry Finn, like lighting out on the Mississippi and stories like that. And then I also encountered new works out of my curiosity. So I started reading this book, The Call of Solitude, by a psychologist, and some works of philosophy. So this is all to say that as I was exploring this question, I was reading, and then the reading informs how I'm looking at the question. And so I try to weave those encounters with literature into the writing and make them really transparent.
I love that. And I love that you're saying it's each essay deals with an aspect of something of motherhood, womanhood that you find confusing or you want some more clarity on. That's a great organizing principle for the memoir and essays. This is something about me that you might not know. I was once on the board of directors of a group called Mothers and More, which was a
Mm,
national nonprofit that was centered around the idea that most of mother's work is invisible. And you
mhm,
touch on that theme very strongly in the book.
mhm,
For example, your husband, Paul, would take your daughter to a birthday party and be the face at the party, but all the invisible labor that went on behind the scenes of you getting the gift and making sure she's dressed correctly and all of that, that's all your work. And it's so true. And I think
mhm,
that, you also posit that what if women were doing that work, then you would have the creative energy to do so much else. And I remember writing a blog post when I was doing mom blogging after a career in magazines, after I had my daughter in midlife. And I wrote, like, where is my creativity? I miss my creativity. It's all
mhm,
into parenting and learning about parenting, learning about mothering. There's so many important points that you bring up and you connect it to your own stories and you also connect it to like the universal conundrum that women facing being mothers or being parents have to deal with. And I came to motherhood late. I was in my 40s when I had my daughter. She's a teenager now. And I feel like in your 20s, it must be so much harder because you haven't lived life. I was able to bring a confidence, sort of not worrying about what other people thought to the table that I would not have had in my
mhm.
20s, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sort of two minds on this topic because, on the one hand, the mental load is real. Any mom friend, whether she's a creator or no matter what work she does beyond parenting, or even if parenting is her central work, the mental load and the number of details that we carry and juggle in our minds on a daily basis is actually really astounding. And I think the demands of that have only increased over the years. There's actually been research and data on this, which I cite in my book, just about how little free time women and mothers have compared to even 30 years ago. So, on the one hand, that's very real, and there are many systemic reasons for this mental load. On the other hand, there is so much about caregiving and motherhood that has fueled my creativity. it absolutely, in a sort of logistical daily way, pulls me from my work. It can be hard to find the time, or I finally find the time, and then, the school nurse calls because my child needs to be picked up from school. Like this kind of push pull is ever present. But my own writing, this book, was definitely fueled by motherhood. It was fueled by the revelations of motherhood. It was fueled by the ways that motherhood attuned me to many of the same concerns I'd always thought about. I've always thought of myself as a feminist, but having children intensified some of those concerns because now they were personal in a whole new way. But, I had grappled with beauty standards for women in our culture on a personal level as a girl, as a young woman, and as many women do, and that was difficult. But once I had children, it was one thing for me to turn against my own body because of these standards. It was one thing for me to starve myself, as I did in college and for some years beyond, to meet standards of our culture. But the idea of my daughters ever turning against their own bodies or being taught to hate their own bodies because of our culture intensified my longing to express myself on these issues. So while motherhood pulls me from the work, in many ways it's also the fire in the forging process. Like it really helps clarify and crystallize things for me and pulls me to the page too.
I love that. What's so interesting about your book is that you touch on so much and you also circle back to your family. So,
Mm,
for example, I'm not going to give it all away. Your mother wasn't brave in certain respects. And there's a later part of the book where you're brave in sharing your wants and your needs, which foments intimacy and communication. And it is an act of bravery for a woman to say what she needs in a partnership because
yes.
I think a lot of times people wouldn't say what they needed because they were afraid they wouldn't get it or they just couldn't voice it. Maybe that's part of the feminism, maybe that's part of just having your own agency. I don't know.
I think a few things. I think partly it might be generational, that when I look back on the time in which my mother became a mother, her childhood was in the 1950s, and she married my father in 1970 and became a mother shortly after that. So probably missed like the real first wave feminist movement that erupted a little later in the decade. I feel fortunate in some ways to have grown up in the climate that I did, where I think is certainly not perfect. We have a long way to go, but a little bit more comfort expressing ourselves and voicing our needs. And then I've thought about this a number of times, how I've learned from my mother's experience and have maybe avoided some of the pitfalls that she encountered because I had the great benefit of learning from her experience. And so I have real compassion for her and maybe what she went through during her marriage and the ways she wasn't able to voice her concerns and needs, and how I've learned to do so because of that.
That's great. That's a lot of growth. I mean, that's strength as well. How did this idea come about? I mean, you had different essays, one which actually won a Pushcart Prize.
Mm.
And I've seen a lot of people who were nominated, but you've actually won a Pushcart Prize. So bravo.
Oh, thank you.
You say in the book that you had different essays that were in different literary publications,
Hmm.
Hippocampus and River Teeth. What made you think, okay, this is the organizing premise, and also this is how I'm going to do it? I like to get into the structure.
Sure. So when I began writing this book, I didn't know I was writing a book. The book really began as individual essays that were intended to exist as standalone essays. I wrote three or so or four essays and was publishing them in literary journals. And it started to dawn on me that all of them were circling around very similar themes, even if they were coming at it from different angles, or if on the surface they seemed like they were about entirely different topics, that driving them all was this question of that blurry line between truth and fiction in women's lives, and how do we bump up against that in different ways. So once I realized that, I did start to envision a project of a larger scope for the essays, and to imagine a book length project that wove them together and elaborated on this theme. And then that informed the essays that I wrote from there, because I wanted to fill in some of the blanks. So, for instance, the book is called Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, and there is definitely some material that addresses motherhood explicitly. But I really wanted the book to illuminate the ways that the myths that we absorb about motherhood and being a good mother and what makes a good mother are just part of a series of myths that we absorb about womanhood, starting as girls, right? That it is one of the archetypes in a series of archetypes that follow us through our lives. So, maidenhood, right, on to early adulthood as a woman, through motherhood if one chooses to become a mother. What happens if you don't choose to become a mother in your childbearing years, and what archetypes are imposed on you then? We're seeing a lot of that in our culture now with all the commentary about being a childless cat lady. You know, what happens to you once you graduate from your fertile years and become sort of invisible as an older woman, or irrelevant, or possibly even witchy or malignant in some way. So that became very much an organizing principle for the book. And I really wanted to write in ways that explored all of these different archetypes over the course of the female lifespan. And the book moves more or less chronologically through time. So my children are younger in the earlier essays than they are in the later essays. I wanted the reader to have that experience of growing with us and following our story. But also thematically, the earlier essays are much more focused on girlhood and young adulthood, and then they move through motherhood, and then they sort of land in the sort of crony older woman years, and even contemplate death. So I have the entire, lifespan in the book.
Your POV on your dad seems to change as well throughout the
Hmm.
book,
Hmm.
which is interesting to me.
I'm so curious to hear more about that, actually, what you saw, and maybe I can speak to it.
So I think that in the beginning, you wanted to be her confidant when your mom talked to you. You wanted to be her friend. That
Mm.
was meaningful to you. And so it was easier to kind of push your father's pain aside. And then later, when you became a mother, when you became a wife, you looked at it differently, because some of the choices that your mother had made, you were faced with similar types of choices, and you thought, oh, okay, now I'm thinking of my dad a little bit differently. So maybe the compassion that you later extended to your mother, outside of being her confidant, you also later extended to your father.
That is so true, and so so astute. You could be a therapist maybe, because like I'm
This is
seeing
one of
things
my therapy sessions.
I'm seeing things in new ways. I think that's absolutely true. One of the things I find so fascinating about living as you spend more time on the planet is how stories that we've told ourselves for so long can suddenly shift or disintegrate and look very different depending on what life stage we're at. I write in the book about how, looking at my own parents and looking back at my childhood, over the years, I have seen my father as a wounded victim. I have seen him as a villain bent on revenge. I have seen him in these different ways, but it's all filtered through where I am in my life. And it really goes to show how much truth is so based in perception. And I think it's absolutely true that I, as a person who has now been married for 20 years and I've been with my husband for 22, I have such a deeper understanding of the complexities of marriage and the phases that they go through and the work it takes, to maintain a healthy marriage. And I'm able to look back on my own parents' marriage and its challenges with so much more understanding and compassion.
What's great about your work is that you may start with the personal, but you use literature and use connections to expand it. So it is that universal. So everybody can read it and say, okay, well, this is how I see myself too. The New Pretty, I mean,
Mhm.
that was fascinating because, I mean, look, I'm wearing makeup, I'm wearing eyelashes, I color my hair. And you even admit in it that you thought about, do I leave the gray? Because my daughter, at the time she was younger, and she said, well, your mom had had a change also, and it gave you a new understanding of who you were at that time when your mom was making a change to her appearance. But they end it by saying that you are still coloring your hair for now.
Yes, 100%. I would argue that there might be no area of experience in which the split between what we know and understand intellectually as women and how we move through the world in an embodied way is so stark. We know intellectually that it should not matter how much we weigh, what color our hair is, or whether there are some wrinkles in our forehead. Not only do we know that, but part of us knows that the strongest that we could be is to say, this is who I am. This is what is beautiful. These messages that we're getting from our culture are total bullshit, and to sort of embrace that strength. But it is extremely hard to separate ourselves from the culture in which we are a part. That culture, it is much a part of us, and we are as much a part of that culture as anything else. It doesn't stand outside of us. We have absorbed it into our bodies. And so I was really trying to get at that essay to really look at the violences that women are encouraged to commit against themselves due to beauty standards, whether
Like, you
it's
mean eating disorders
oh,
or
there's so
what
many.
you
Yeah. So
don't
eating
want?
disorders, plastic surgery, bleaching creams, in certain cultures to try to lighten the skin, illegal plastic surgeries that have ended in people's deaths, right? Like all of
Yeah.
this is actually quite violent. I wanted to explore that, but I also wanted to allow for some grace, right? And just to really acknowledge that this is an ongoing struggle. It's not a struggle with an easy answer. It's not as simple as to say, like, I am woman, hear me roar. And I'm like throwing all that by the wayside. That essay was just my way of grappling with that complication.
I love that essay, and if I can read a small piece from
Mm.
it that really resonated for me, and I'll explain why. It's about Barbie. So you said, today's fantasy woman is also, in her way, a hybrid of the real and manufactured Galatea in reverse. We are disturbed by photos of women who have undergone rounds of procedures to turn themselves into eerie, living Barbie dolls. And yet, every day, in smaller ways, women fictionalize their bodies. We fuse ourselves with the inorganic, acrylic nails and porcelain veneers, hair extensions and lash extensions, color contacts and tanning sprays. We petrify our nerve endings with synthetic toxins, turning feeling flesh into cold, mute clay. We become, by degrees, living statues and cyborgs. And first of all, the language is just so beautiful. But when it comes to Barbie, so here's the other side of this, right? When I was a magazine editor in New York City, I had an opportunity to meet a woman who had had like 50 plastic surgery procedures to look like Barbie. She was
Mhm.
very famous. She was in all the magazines.
Yes.
And I met her at an event. I didn't look like Barbie. And I wasn't as thin as she was. She was thin. I'm chesty, but she, had the everything Barbie. Yet she was terribly, terribly insecure. And with the circle of men that were there from the magazine, guess who held center stage? It wasn't her because she was
Mhm.
so insecure. And I thought to myself, wow,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
It made a difference to me. And I thought, you can have beauty and you can have emotional intelligence and you can have intelligence. If you have beauty without emotional intelligence, you're screwed, or
Mhm.
intelligence, you're screwed. But
Mhm.
if you can manage to get yourself to a point where you have enough of each, I'm not saying you
Mhm.
have to be, the most beautiful person in the world, but if you can pull a piece from each, then you have power. And that taught me a really important lesson.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on the psychology here, but I have to think that when we grasp, these sort of physical quote unquote improvements, that what we are longing for and yearning for is completeness, is strength, is confidence, is wholeness. And I think there really is this sense that that can be achieved through beauty. There's also a commercial aspect to this as well, because teaching women that they are always one step away from being beautiful, right? That all they need is, this particular serum or this particular concealer or whatnot is very profitable. It's a huge, huge industry around this.
Huge. You go to
Uh,
Sephora, I mean, you can't even believe it. It's like there are
yeah,
8-year-olds there, which is
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, absolutely.
So you talk about where's the line between a healthy rejection of female stereotypes and misogyny absorbed and turned inward? And that's a real profound statement that you explore in one of the essays. Can you speak a little to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I started thinking about this a number of years ago. I think when my oldest was 9, she longed for a girl power t-shirt, right? Just the slogan girl power. And I was like, like as like a 90s feminist, like riot girl, like kind of a
Yeah.
person, I was like, yeah, that's great, girl power. But I started to think about it a little bit. What does that mean, right? What does that mean, girl power, right? Like, is it power defined by what is like traditionally masculine traits? And I have felt very conflicted with my daughters because, on the one hand, as I write about, I kind of grew up with this romantic idea of the tomboy, right? Like Joe March, from Little Women, like getting into scrapes and sullying her petticoats, and Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Like these were sort of my literary heroes. And what made them heroic was that they were not like typical girls, right? And they were more like boys. And so there is something inherently problematic about that. And in terms of my own children, I started thinking about it more because, on the one hand, especially with my oldest, was always really conscious about not focusing on her appearance, not praising her only for how her skirt twirled, like, or, oh, you look so beautiful in that dress, or the things that girls in our culture tend to be praised for. And my daughter was what we might call, like, I think tomboy is a very problematic term because it suggests there's only one proper way to be a girl. But she was what historically would have been called a tomboy. We have this set of plastic cups that are all different colors, blue, green, red. Like when I would take the dishes out of the cabinet and put the pink cup in front of her, she would reject the pink cup. She'd be like, ooh, like pink, you know? And that just sparked my curiosity, right? Like, on the one hand, I do feel like I've raised her and all of my children trying to point out gender stereotypes and to reject them. But I also started to wonder, like, is there some unconscious way in which I've sent my daughter the message that it's not okay to embrace things like pink, right? Like, that it's not okay to embrace dresses, that it's not okay to embrace the things that might be called derogatorily girly. Again, like most of my essays, I don't think I land on a clear answer to that question, but it is something that I'm deeply interested in and that I explore in the book.
You also explore in the book that you kind of embrace the part of your husband that's like patriarchal, and I relate to that.
Absolutely.
I've also
Right.
been almost married 20 years. This year's 20 years, and I've known him for 22 years, so I
Yeah.
get it.
I think we have to be honest about these things because I think if we're not, it's really hard to move past them. I mean, I think this is sort of the flip side of what I was saying about my daughter and her rejection of things feminine. I write about this in my essay, Hag of the Deep, about very much wanting to raise my son in such a way that he will always stay in touch with his feelings and his sensitivity. He happens to be a really deep feeler too, like of my three children, probably the most sensitive and feels things really, really deeply. I've always told him that that's his superpower. That is always something that he should treasure and have always resisted having any guns or toy swords in the house. You know, really tried to keep away the violent video games, all of these things that I think, you know, there's so many other parents who share these concerns. And in that essay, what I grapple with is that on the one hand, I have this vision of wanting to raise my son to be a feminist and to continue to embrace his sensitive side. And on the other hand, I married somebody who is very much embodies what our culture believes that a man should be. This can mean many things, but in the case of my husband, what it means is that he keeps his feelings pretty close to the bone. He really keeps his own counsel. He is a, you know, a take charge sort of a person. If there's a problem at hand, if there's something that needs to be solved, is there something that needs to be done, he'll like step in before me very often to just do it. And this became really apparent when we were courting, right? Like when I first met him when I was 25, and it was part of what attracted me to him, right? I found that attractive. And so I try to be really upfront in that essay about this duality or about this tension, right? It's not easy enough just to say, the world should be this way and the world should embrace my son in this way. I think we need to kind of again acknowledge that we are part of this culture, that we have absorbed it. And the moment that really brought that home for me, which I described in the essay, is when my mother was visiting when my son was like 2 and he was in a diaper, like he was trotting around my
He was
family room.
manly, and he
Like
was
he's
manly.
like, and my mom, we're like drinking coffee, and my mother's like, you know, he's really macho. And I look at my mom and I'm like, Mom, he's 1. He's wearing a diaper. Like, what are you talking about? But then I also like grabbed him as he was trotting by me and I like flipped him upside down and I was like smothering him in kisses. And I was like, who's my macho baby? You know, like, who's my little man? And I was like, what is coming out of my mouth? So, you know, we contain these things and
Because,
we
yeah.
contain multitudes. And for me as a writer, that's always what interests me. I'm not interested in preaching. I'm not interested in trying to convert somebody to my point of view. I'm just trying to grapple honestly on the page with the multitudes that we contain, to question them and to look at them and to describe them. And that's what's interesting to
And
me.
it really comes through. Okay, your ending is memento mori. Can you maybe explain that one and how you're coming full circle? Can you talk about your choice on making this the last essay of the book and a little bit about it as well?
Sure. So it's definitely the shortest essay in the book. You know, it's more of a flash essay, it's more of a vignette or a scene. And the scene is of me and my youngest child lying in bed at night, just a normal bedtime, me putting her to bed. And, you know, that tension is still there between wanting to, you know, be there for my daughter, but also it's late, I'm tired, you know, one leg is creeping its way out of the bed because I just want, you know, the sort of like parade of bedtime tasks to be over. And she, of course, like many children, is begging me to tell her another story, which I do. I tell her little things from my life when I put her to bed at night. And The essay sort of plays out as me in this moment remembering death. It's called Memento Mori because of sort of the old Latin phrase, that one lives their life more fully and with more attention and more richness if they keep death in mind, if they always remember that one day I will die. And I am sort of reminded of that in this moment with my daughter and choose to stay and to tell her story. And in doing so, the story is about a ring that my grandmother left for me, my most beloved grandmother. It's on my finger, right? So it's this physical object that my grandmother has left me and a reminder of her. But I tell her my stories. I continue to tell her my stories because I'm reminded in that moment that that is what we leave our children. And we have the power and privilege of shaping who they are through the stories that we tell them. And so that felt like the right note to end the book on.
It's really beautiful. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share?
I mean, if there's anyone who's listening who has many responsibilities and is maybe wants to create, but feels pulled in a lot of directions. Maybe it will be heartening to hear that I wrote this book pulled in so many directions. I started this book when I had a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 8-year-old. And it was written in the pockets of time between these other tasks. I think it's so easy to look at a book and to think that it came from some like concerted time. And all this book was an accumulation of small moments and just keeping at it, keeping at the writing. And the writing is very much embedded in the everyday in that way too.
That's
Yeah.
very inspiring words. What other writing advice can you give somebody who is maybe trying to put their essays down or write their memoir and just is kind of struggling, not just with time, but with getting the scenes out, I suppose?
Well, I mean, a couple things. One would be to maybe not worry at the beginning how things are going to fit together. Sometimes what I do, because I can be paralyzed when I look at a blank page on my screen, right? Like the Microsoft Word document. Sometimes what I do is write longhand, not the whole essay in my journal, but just a scene, right? Like, okay, I know that somewhere in this piece, I want to write about that moment between me and my husband when we were driving the other day. So I'll just write that scene in longhand, no pressure. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I have found that in the end, like some of the writing that has the most, I like to call it heat, right? Like it has the most life, are scenes that I write elsewhere in a sort of looser way and then put into the document.
That's interesting. Christy Tate, who was a guest on my program, talked about finding the heat in your writing. And Joan
Mm.
Rakoff talked about writing longhand. And I went, I got a whole bunch of memo pads and I basically use it when I'm teaching.
Yeah, for me, it allows a stream of consciousness that typing, word processing doesn't, because you can always delete, delete. Oh, no, that's not how I want to say that, and change it. But it's just to get it down on paper. It can be totally crappy. It's just getting it there. And I think if you write long enough, something good comes out, even if it's just a description, right? Or a word that you use, like something usable comes out and it feels very low stakes. So that's something I would advise.
And you have so many great words throughout your book. In my book, I talk about having a word bank. Like when I see a good word, like I saw the word detritus a while ago, and I was like, I have to use that. And I ended up using it in an essay. Do you do that as well?
I do actually. I have like a page in my notebook, which is really just a mess. So there's no rhyme or reason to it. But in the back, I have one page for like new essay ideas. Like one day I want to write this, or one day I want to write this. And then I also just have words. A lot of times it's words that I come across that I actually didn't know. And I just want to record them and write them down. I just love words. Like I've just always been in
You
love with
could
words.
tell, anyone could tell that you love words by reading. And the way you put them together is just so beautiful.
Well, thank
Is
you.
it's important topics with literary flair, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Estelle.
Oh, my pleasure. And so, what about if somebody's trying to write a scene? Like, is there something you would recommend that they do first? Get the sensory language out or the dialogue? Like, is there a way that you do it?
For me, I try always to return to the five senses and what I'm feeling in my body. If I was trying to write a scene, I'm gonna like try to sink back into the the memory, and really, what did it smell like in that room? What did the air feel like? What color were the curtains? What was the sound of my interlocutor's voice? And I do think that that serves two purposes. One, it obviously paints a clear picture for the reader, which is always lovely and helpful. But I do think that it's in those details that the emotion of the scene comes through. And how we view things, how we see them, is very much impacted by our psychic state. Because, I mean, it's sort of like the glass half empty, half full. Like, you can see a half empty container of yogurt in your refrigerator. And if you're in a bad mood, you can say, like, ugh, like, I have so many things to take care of and I'm so behind and I haven't even cleaned out my refrigerator, right? Or you can see that yogurt and you can think, oh, good, I still have half yogurt like to have with my lunch. This is awesome. And so how we process these details shows so much in a scene.
That's great. Absolutely. I agree. Yeah, it's like, even I say in my book, with the kaleidoscope, you could say it looks like runny eggs, or you could say it looks like a rainbow exploded,
100%.
This has been such a great discussion.
Yeah, I agree. It's so fun.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you for having me.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website, and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.